beerdigt werden sollte. Also meine Mutter hatte man schon 2 Kränze und auch eine Bouquets gebracht. Das soll ich aber vom Weg noch sehen.
At that time I was in a very bad way and I didn't want to have anything to do with God anymore, so I tried to take my own life. I jumped out of the window, mezzanine 3rd floor, which is like from the 4th floor. I was hoping my life was over now, but then I was suddenly out of my physical body. I saw my body lying below, and I myself was floating above it. At first I didn't really get it that it was my own body whimpering and moaning down there. And when I realized it, there was a jolt and I was back in my body. Then, when I was being driven to the hospital, I was suddenly out of my body again. I hovered over the ambulance and saw everything from above. During this time I never had any pain, and I observed everything completely neutrally. Then I had surgery in the hospital, and I could see everything clearly from outside of my body again. But there still seemed to be some connection to my body, because it was responding to my thoughts. At that time I was employed as an operating room nurse in this hospital, and if, for example, an instrument was requested, I reacted mentally accordingly, and my physical body on the operating table then also reacted to these mental impulses and moved slightly. This made the staff very nervous. It was awful for the anesthetist, because he seemed to think I was awake, so he kept giving me more and more anesthetic. But my body was not awake, it was my subconscious, or rather my spiritual self. I myself had finished with life. I wanted nothing more to do with this world, so I resisted coming back into my body, and now even more so, because the body was badly damaged. And once you're floating outside of your body, you don't want to leave that state. It's so easy and free. So there was no way I wanted to go back into this broken house, back into this body. I had resisted it very much, especially since I didn't want to be in this world before. Eventually my body was pronounced dead and it was taken to the morgue. I then saw my mother preparing the funeral, getting wreaths and bouquets. The morning of the day I was to be buried, the doctors came up with the idea that they could dissect me. Because I had 10 fractures, every type of fracture there was, so the doctors figured they could learn something by dissecting me. When they came to get my body, though, they noticed that my body wasn't even cold yet. All this time my body lay in the hospital morgue. Nevertheless, I perceived everything, all my immediate and distant surroundings, and indeed much more keenly than with the usual physical senses. It's a completely different kind of perception you have there. For example, I was aware of the doctors who wanted to dissect me long before they actually got to the morgue where my body lay. It's a different kind of hearing, and you perceive things more in terms of vibrations. There were 2 other bodies in the morgue with me, I felt them too. And before the doctors were even in my room I could hear they were on their way, and I knew what they were talking about. And when they then entered the room and realized that the body wasn't ready yet, I observed the situation completely neutrally, soberly, without emotions. I thought to myself, well, they can learn a lot, so let them dissect me. So I wasn't afraid at all, not frightened at all. There were no emotions. I took it in as if I were a robot, because this broken house, this body, didn't concern me at all anymore. I was only involved to the extent that I just realized that I should be dissected, and I agreed mentally. That was all. The doctors were joking, too. These were former colleagues of mine, and when I told them much later what kind of jokes they had cracked, they were shocked and asked me, "Who told you that?" At this point I would like to mention one thing that is important to me. When you are standing by a dying person's bed, you should never speak as if the dying person cannot hear. On the contrary, their perception might be much more pronounced. One perceives much more telepathically than usual, including all the feelings of the people involved. You can feel very clearly what others are thinking and feeling, even if they don't say it at all. But when they say it, you perceive it even more clearly. Therefore, for example, the bereaved should not lament, complain, or fight about the inheritance. I don't think that happens in our circles, but if it does happen somewhere, then I think it must be terrible for the dying person if there are conflicts among the relatives. You hear and feel everything so clearly. You sense the moods and attitudes of others very precisely, both the good and the bad. This all happened to me back in 1947. The occupation was still going on, and denazification was not yet complete. One day I felt hostility from someone who thought that I should die as a Nazi pig, even though he didn't say so. You can feel all this much more clearly than usual. But at the same time, I only noticed it, observed it, without it causing me fear or fright. Then my situation became complicated, because I came to the other side with guilt, so to speak. I was then allowed to perceive the divine light for the first time. I could also see deceased people I knew. But that was all I experienced positively. Then I was allowed into levels, or rather I had to go into levels and depths that were shaped by my guilt, and I have to say that it wasn't very nice. It made me realize, in my Father's house there are many mansions. I also came to understand the meaning of spirit, soul, and body. I could perceive different levels of our existence. It felt like I was perceiving everything at once. Somehow I was collectively connected to everything. It's a connection that you don't have with your physical senses, because your physical shell separates you from others. But without a body, one not only hears and sees others, but perceives them transparently and empathizes with them. Here on earth we often only open ourselves to familiar people, but on the other side it extends quite automatically, and much further than individual beings. I collectively perceived everything in the afterlife, even horrific levels where there is fear and terror. Those were worlds where thought patterns are enormous, and where these overwhelm you so that you first have to learn and understand that these are thought patterns that repeat themselves and correspond to your own problems, with which you crossed into the other world. It was also less nice that I kept seeing my life in front of me like a film, and not only life in words and works, but also in thoughts and feelings. It was sometimes horrifying that there were suddenly negative things in my life that I had long forgotten and repressed. But I had to experience these very vividly again. And this repeated itself several times. I kept experiencing certain special things that were somehow unfinished. That was partly horrifying. I then came back into the body, or, rather, I had to go back. And although I also experienced horror and terror on the other side, although I faced my guilt, I longed for it. Because this lightness and floating was beautiful. But because of my guilt and unfinished business, I was urging myself to get back into the body. At first I resisted it very much, but then I realized that I need this physical life to accomplish some unfinished business. But there was no judgment, as we often imagine. What we call hell is our own conscience. My own conscience was the worst, the harshest judge, not others. There stood no angel with a flaming sword. Your own conscience is hard but fair. My problem repeated itself in such a way that I had a strong urge to find a solution. So I even gladly renounced this state of limbo and gladly accepted the opportunity to go back into this broken body that I originally wanted to throw away. That return to the body was terrifying in itself, and even more so because it was very injured. But having to face my unresolved problems again and again in this out-of-body state was much worse. So I gladly went back into the body. I was then in cast for another 2 years, but was able to leave my body several times. Once you've been out of the body, it's easier to get out again later. I then had the grace not only to experience darkness in the afterlife. In the meantime, I have had 2 strokes, through which I was also able to experience light worlds in the afterlife. In the bodiless state you can move so freely, and it's beautiful when you perceive some place you want to be, and you're there. I experienced starry worlds, and just thinking about wanting to be there, I was already there. And it's wonderful when you feel that you're developing mentally and can leave unresolved aspects of your personality behind you, so I was able to get closer to the divine light. It was often all the more difficult to get back on the other side, into the body. It took years before I could say yes to this earthly existence again. The other side had actually become more of a home for me. I was more anchored in the other world. With the out-of-body experiences, I also became clairvoyant. In concrete terms, this means that I could perceive, on a mental level, when people were close to death. Although I didn't meet these people physically, I could smell their upcoming death, and 2 or 3 days later they actually died. However, I was glad when this clairvoyance eventually disappeared, as it had been a burden over the years. I sometimes thought I should develop this clairvoyance, mature with it. Some people wish for this ability and this close contact with the afterlife, but when I lost that again, I preferred it. It was a burden for me to know so often who would die in 2 or 3 days. Today I try to enlighten people a bit about death and to take away their fear of it. In my experience, there are few who are not afraid of death. I sometimes report about the hereafter in hospitals at the request of the pastor, but there are just a few who prepare for death, most resist it, although the other side is really beautiful. And even when, as it was in my case, one experiences not only beauty but also the burden of unredeemed things in the afterlife, I can say from my personal experience that the other side is beautiful. Dying is beautiful.
In meiner Lage, wo man eine Schuld mit hat, wo eigentlich auch vieles ist, was einen belastet. Die andere Seite, Sterben, ist schön.